Good evening and welcome to our program this evening. My name is Thorin Tritter. I'm the Museum and Programming Director at the Holocaust Memorial and Tolerance Center of Nassau County, which is located in Glen Cove, New York. I'm excited to be holding our program this evening with New York Times bestselling author Meg Waite Clayton, who'll be talking about the Kindertransport that rescued 10,000 children from Nazi-controlled Europe, and her award-winning novel, The Last Train to London, which has the Kindertransport at its core. Before we get to her presentation, though, I do want to put in a plug for some other upcoming programs that we have lined up. This coming Sunday, we are hosting a concert for peace to raise money for the United Ukrainian American Relief Committee. The concert is going to be held live in our building. To see if we still have tickets, I ask you to email concertforpeace2022@gmail.com and check for availability. But even if there are not any tickets available, I hope you'll go to our website and make a donation to support the Relief Committee's work. So that's concertforpeace2022@gmail.com. And the concert is on Sunday, live in our building. Then on Wednesday, April 6th, I'll be back for my next Curator's Corner, where I give a short presentation about a particular object or image in our collection. On April 6th, I'll be talking actually about Holocaust survivor Jackie Handley, who was born in Salonika, Greece, and then survived deportation and imprisonment in Auschwitz. We have excerpts from Jackie Handley's testimony in a number of places in our galleries, and so I will be talking about him and what he went through during the war. And one final program to mention, on Sunday, April 10th, we'll be hosting the next session in our Sunday with Survivors series, in this case with Holocaust survivor Judith Steele, who traveled as an infant with her family on the SS St. Louis that departed Germany in 1939, only to be returned or forced to return to Europe. Judith and her family were placed into the Gurs internment camp in France, although her father was able to get Judith out of the camp and into hiding with a Catholic family, although Judith never saw her family again. You can find more details about these programs, how to register for them, and a full list of our upcoming schedule on our website at www.hmtcli.org, and then click on the events tab. Okay, enough advertisements. Let me stop sharing my screen. I am very pleased to introduce our speaker this evening, award-winning novelist Meg Waite Clayton. Meg Waite Clayton is the author of 8 novels that have become New York Times bestsellers, including her most recent book, The Postmistress of Paris, which has been recognized with awards from Good Morning America, People Magazine, USA Today, the Book of the Month Club, and various others. But she will be speaking tonight about her prior novel, a National Jewish Book Award finalist and international bestseller, The Last Train to London, which is based on the true story of the Kindertransport. She tells the story through 2 narrative threads. One follows the lives of 2 teenagers, one Jewish and one Christian, who are living in Vienna in the 1930s and confront a new world when the Nazis invade in 1938. And the other thread explores the true life work of Truus Wijsmuller, a member of the Dutch resistance who risked her life on numerous occasions as she smuggled Jewish children out of Germany. I'm going to leave it to Meg Waite Clayton to tell us more about her book, the stories, and her research. But one more comment from me before I pass the baton, and that is, if you out there have questions for Meg Waite Clayton, please use the Q&A feature of Zoom, type in your questions, and I'll make sure to get them in front of our guest at the end of her presentation. Okay, so with that introduction and outline of our plan, I'm delighted to welcome Meg Waite Clayton. Thank you so much for being here.
Lauren, thank you so much for having me, and thank you everybody who's here. I will tell you all that my mom very recently passed away last week, and this was her favorite book of mine. And I've been doing a lot of speaking recently about The Postmistress of Paris, but it is a particular joy to have the first presentation, the first chat I'm doing after my mom's passing from her very favorite of my books. So I'm going to start, I'm going to jump in with a little screen share here. So hold on, let me make sure I can do this. Okay, that should be this one. Okay, I hope what you're seeing there is I think a slide of a bunch of my books, but hold on. These are all the Yeah, those are all the foreign copies of my books, but hold on. Oh, there we go. Okay, now I'm going to have you take a look at that and have a guess what it is. Normally, if I were there in person, I just ask people to shout out what it is. So feel free to do so from your comfort at home with probably your mute button on so I can't hear you. But while you're shouting, I'll take a moment to thank you for joining me here in this way, in this complicated time, and to thank Thorin and everyone who had a hand in arranging this gathering. I confess that my days are not much different than usual. I spend them alone in my playhouse writing room with my imaginary friends writing books. But I do miss so many people right now, and so it's nice to have this way to stay connected. So if you haven't guessed yet, this is a Band-Aid box. I will tell you that in all the research I did, seeing this was one of the most moving. I actually stood in front of it for several moments weeping. I saw it in New York. It was a sort of a weird thing to get emotional over, a Band-Aid box, but the docent said, yes, the Band-Aid box, it gets everyone. So if you've read the book, and I know some of you read it for your book group, and I really appreciate that, and I hope you enjoyed your chat. But if you've read it, you're probably scratching your head trying to remember a bandage box in the book. So I'll tell you that there isn't one, as by the time I saw it, it was too late to get it in the book. But this is a photo of an actual bandage box that was put in a suitcase 80 some years ago. Sent by parents with their child going on a train to live in England without them to escape Hitler. That's what the Kindertransport was, a British effort begun in late 1938, just after Kristallnacht, to rescue some 10,000 children from the Reich in what would be the last months before World War II began. So I'm going to talk for maybe a half hour to go through some images and give you some basics about the story and about the Kindertransport and whatever. But as Thorin said, please just post questions in the chat whenever they occur to you, because I truly want to talk about whatever you are interested in talking about. So, okay, so again, raise your virtual hand or shout out again if you know who this is. And while you're doing that, I'm going to take this moment to thank the NIOD in the Netherlands for allowing me to use this photo. So this is the real Truus Wijsmuller. She's Dutch, and she's a real life hero on the scale of Oskar Schindler of Schindler's List fame. She played a huge role in the Kindertransport, then was so completely forgotten that not even anyone in my Dutch publisher had heard of her before they read The Last Train. I'm going to speak for a little bit today about where this novel started, spoiler alert, not with Truus, and the real story behind it, including how hard it was to dig up some of the real history on which it's based. Let me skip forward here. Oh, there we go. So The Last Train to London, as most of you know, I think, at this point, is based on the true story of the Kindertransport effort to rescue these 10,000 children from Nazi-occupied Europe before World War II began, and this one extraordinary woman who led the effort. And the best introduction I have to it, and sort of to the Kindertransport effort for that matter, is about 30 seconds long, and I like to share it because it includes real photos and real footage of the effort, so bear with me. I personally find that footage so moving. It's actually most of those last scenes are from an effort by Nicholas Winton to get children out of Prague at the end of the Kindertransport effort. And that video is the work of my very talented, Ashley Clayton, who is I call her my bonus daughter. I got her as a part of my marriage vows, and she's a lovely part of my family. So, okay. So The Last Train to London is sometimes described as Truus's story, but as I said, it didn't begin for me with Truus. It began for me a decade ago when my usually chatty teenage son arrived home troublingly silent. His name is Nick, and he is a very joyful. He was a very joyful boy who's grown into a very joyful man now. But he used to come home from robotics or theater or whatever he was doing, riding his bike down the middle of the street, singing, so that all the neighbors could hear him. And fortunately, he has a truly lovely singing voice. But this particular day, he came home without really, it was just really, really unusually quiet for himself. And it turned out he'd come from the local children's theater where he had interviewed somebody separated from her family when she was 9. So I first began to learn about the Kindertransport effort in order to help my young son understand what he was learning about, which had moved him to silence. Nick and his theater friends would go on to interview 4 women saved in the Kindertransport effort: Ellen Fletcher, Helga Newman, Elizabeth Miller, and Margot Lowry, who has since become a wonderful friend to me. But before they could write the play their director had in mind, the director died of stomach cancer. The kids began to scatter off to college as kids do and never did write their play. But I was left haunted by this story. I was left trying to imagine if I could, as a parent, turn my child over to strangers, allowing them to be taken to another country where they didn't know the language or the customs or have anyone to love them. I was left trying to imagine what it was like for those children to leave everything they knew and loved behind. For most of the time I was learning about the Kindertransport, reading books, watching documentaries, eventually listening to, and reading interviews with people involved in the effort, including rescued children. I wasn't thinking I could write a book about an attempt organized primarily by Jewish leaders in Britain, including Simon Marks and, let's see, so, wait, I'm ahead of myself here. Simon Marks, he's there on the bottom right, and Norman and Helen Bentwich, the other 2 photos. To try to bring mostly Jewish children from Nazi-occupied Europe to safety in England in the year before World War II began. So here's a little secret: I'm not Jewish. So I'd learned fairly early on about Nicholas Winton, who'd led the Prague transports, which gave me the idea that there must have been someone leading the Vienna rescues. So I went searching and found, finally, truly years into this experience, the name Truus Wijsmuller. After I had her name, I found an online entry for Truus in Righteous Among Nations, which you probably all know is an honor bestowed on non-Jews who helped save Jews during the World War II. It didn't even include the word Kindertransport, the entry didn't, but it told me that Truus's big advantage was that she was a Gentile with access to the Nazi power structure. So I'm not Jewish, but neither was Truus. Neither were a lot of people who risked their lives to help others. And so oddly, as daunting as Truus is, when I learned of her, I was suddenly less daunted about taking on this story. So here's another little secret: I'm not Dutch either. That did pose a bit of a problem when it came to research, but I'll get to that. So the story of The Last Train to London is in some ways 3 stories. The story of the many people in England involved in this extraordinary effort, including the executive committee of the Central British Fund in England, which devised the plan and got the effort through Parliament. That's Norman and Helen Bentwich, a publisher named Dennis Cohen, who with Helen drafted the plan. Simon Marks of Marks and Spencer, as I said, the banker Lionel Rothschild, and many others. Also, Prime Minister Chamberlain, Viscount Samuel, whose radio address did a lot to marshal money and persuade people to open their homes to these children. So that's one part of the story, that British side and the organization of the effort to allow these children to come into Britain because the British borders were closed. Or largely closed. So it was also the story of Truus and those on the ground in Vienna who made it happen. And then, of course, the story of the children and their families. But that's where I started writing it, where it started for me with the children and their parents. I basically surrounded myself with photos of some of the real children, including this girl, to create my 2 teenage characters, Sophia Len and Stefan. Sophia Len is the teenage math prodigy, the child of an anti-Nazi journalist and a Christian. You might note that the girl in this picture isn't a teenager. She's also not the same nationality, religion, or even hair color as my character, Sophia Len. But I felt so much compassion and love pour out of me when I first saw this photo, and I poured that emotion into my Sophia Len. I didn't actually know who this girl was the whole time I was writing the novel, and I didn't really want to know. The U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum, where this picture comes from, identifies her only as refugee girl. And for me to have a more anonymous person opens up me to not feeling responsible for telling somebody's a child's real story. But after I finished the novel and the novel sold, I went looking, and I found that the Bullmash collection at Kenyon College identifies her as Helga Kreiner. She's from Berlin, and she was on the very first transport of some, which was a transport of some orphans from Berlin that occurred on December 2nd, 1938. So in the novel, Sophie meets a slightly older boy named Stefan, who again is not this boy, but again, this photo evoked in me an affection that helped me create Stefan. Stefan is an aspiring playwright who, unlike Sophie, has lots of friends. So these children, Stefan and Sophie, are based on hundreds of hours of research about the real children involved in the Kindertransport, but they don't actually exist anywhere but in my mind on the page, and if I've done my job, in the reader's mind as well. One of the benefits of historical fiction rather than straight history is it invites us to step into other shoes, to live other lives. So I hope through this novel to make people feel what this moment in history was like. I hope to help us feel, not just learn, but take into our hearts what it means to close our borders to refugees, and to close our hearts to people in need. And I also hope, and this is where Truus especially comes in, to help us feel how amazing acting courageously and selflessly can be. Atticus Finch, one of my own very in one of my own very favorite novels, To Kill a Mockingbird by Harper Lee, describes courage not as a man with a gun in his hand, but rather it's when you know you're licked before you begin, but you begin anyway and see it through no matter what. And that, to me, is Truus. So Sophie and Stefan do things like kids do everywhere, like riding this Ferris wheel in Prater Park. As you would know if you've read the novel, they become sweet on each other. I'll tell you, Sophie and Stefan do. I'll tell you that I only meant for them to be friends, but teenagers will be teenagers. Stefan's father owns a chocolate business because, well, if I'm writing about a Viennese chocolate maker character, in the name of research, I of course have to taste every bit of chocolate that comes my way. Not just Viennese chocolate, to be clear. No, of course, the real reason is that I wanted to show that the Jewish population of Vienna before the Anschluss was integrated into Vienna society and prosperous, and a chocolate business was as evocative a way as I could think to allow readers, shall we say, a taste of that. Sorry with the dad, what many people call dad humor here. I must be secretly a dad. So before Hitler invaded Austria, more than half of Vienna's bankers, lawyers, and doctors were Jewish, along with half of its journalists. Hitler was just across the border, anti-Semitism was on the rise, but here's the thing. At first, Hitler was seen as a joke. Even after he was made Chancellor of Germany, people thought it was a madness that would pass. And he was across the border. It was hard for people leading comfortable, prosperous lives to imagine that this madness could cross into their own country, that their own businesses and homes and lives would be at risk. Until he wasn't, until he was riding through the Vienna streets with crowds cheering him, like this crowd here. The change that occurred over years in Germany took only a few months in Austria. When 1938 opened, Austria was a free country, its Nazis actually largely imprisoned. In March, Hitler invaded. In November, Kristallnacht, obviously, the night of violence and burning synagogues. So Stefan's father's chocolate business has underneath the building an entrance to a pretty amazing underground world. There were tunnels of various sorts, some natural, some man-made, some sewers. There's a 3-story underground area that used to be a convent. There's an area that used to be a Talmud school. And there is even a place that was an underground horse stable. There's a crypt. And not all the bones are in coffins, I'm sorry to say. So what better place for a teenager to try to kiss an infatuation than in the dark underground where scary guys like Orson Welles hang out? This is seriously Orson Welles in the Vienna underground from a movie filmed in the tunnels under Vienna just after the war. So that movie was a great source of what the tunnels looked like then. You know, one of the loveliest things about being a writer is being able to read all afternoon and call it work, and occasionally even watch old movies and call that work too. As a matter of fact, I've started screenwriting lately, and so I can watch movies all I want and call it work. So in 1938, Hitler crosses the border and takes Austria. People in Vienna realize they need to leave, but by then, borders throughout the world were largely closed to Jews, whose passports Germany was soon stamping with the red J you see here, adding Sarah for the women and Israel for the men, as if a whole people could be dismissed by a single name. They could still leave if they had somewhere to go, but mostly they didn't. After Hitler invaded Austria, desperate parents began placing ads like this in the British papers. This says, urgent. Director of Viennese chocolate factory, whose circumstances are sadly depleted due to political situation, is extremely anxious to place his son with refined and charitable family. Boy, aged 10, is of bright and happy disposition. I'll tell you that when I found this ad, I saw many of these kinds of ads. When I found this ad, I had already made Stefan's father a chocolate maker. He was from the beginning a chocolate maker, but it shows how many of these kinds of ads there were that coincidentally there was one with a chocolate maker, a father of a son. So into this void of children in peril steps Truus Wijsmuller. Truus had begun rescuing children from Nazi Germany by the time the novel opens in real life, but in small numbers. And those organizing the Kindertransport effort hoped to rescue thousands. So my problem was my research on her was turning up absolutely nothing. I'm talking, absolutely nothing. It was December 2016. 8 years after I'd first learned of the Kindertransports, before I came upon this notice of a publication of a biography of Truus. So despite the notice being very conveniently in English, the book was only ever published in Dutch. It was 50 years out of print by the time I was looking for it, with no copies for sale anywhere, and only a half dozen copies even in US libraries. The closest one to me was 2,000 miles away. I'll tell you, I'm in, at the time I was in Palo Alto, California. I'm in Carmel by the sea now, which is just on the coast a little bit south of there, of the Bay Area, the San Francisco Bay Area. And the closest one to me was at the University of Minnesota in Minnesota. So fortunately, my older son's college across the country had a copy. He was in Boston going to school. So when I asked him if he might check it out and copy it for me, there was a long pause on the phone, and I thought, of course, he had literally just started a PhD program, and he was quite sure that he was the least qualified person in the program, and he was working really hard. But what he said was, Mom, copyright laws? You're a lawyer, which I am. And I said, out of print and all that. At which point he quoted back to me my own advice about how if you lose your integrity, you lose everything. So I Google translated the table of contents, which he got for me, and The 29 pages Chris got me. That's what the copyright. That's what the librarians at his university said they could give him without violating a copyright law. So they PDF'd it for him. These 29 pages were in Dutch, which of course I do not speak or read. And actually, it turns out they were not in Dutch. They're in a mixture of Dutch and German, which, as you can imagine, was a real challenge for the amazing translation team of Google Translate and yours truly. I'd copy a paragraph and paste it into Google Translate, and it would come out total gibberish. And then I would go hunting to see where the German was, pull out the German, translate that separately, and then Tetris it all back together to make a translation. I will tell you that that is the worst translation you will ever read of any book ever. But those 29 pages included some great detail about Truus's involvement in the Kindertransport effort. Norm Bentwich came to Amsterdam to recruit her for the effort because she was already known for her work rescuing children. At his request, she left within hours for Amsterdam. When she went to try to meet with Vienna's Jewish leaders, she was arrested and taken in for questioning. And those pages included a very short passage about one of the major obstacles facing Truus helping children escape by then Nazi-occupied Vienna, which was the German in charge of Vienna at the time. He's here with his wife, Vera. He has kids. He loved his mother. Seen from many angles, he looks sort of like a regular guy. But he's actually a young and ambitious, not yet infamous Adolf Eichmann. Yes, that Eichmann, the one who several years later would devise the final solution. He really was the man in charge of Nazi-occupied Austria at the time, and Truus faced him down. If you've read the book, as extraordinary as that scene is, and unbelievable what she does there, it is actually the way it happens. So Toni Morrison once said that if there is a book you want to read and it hasn't been written, you must write it. So this was a story I now wanted to read. And I'm just going to say, Toni Morrison was given both a Pulitzer and a Nobel. So yeah, I do listen to her advice. I also want to say I hope you appreciate the way that nice segue away from Eichmann's photo. He's an evil, ugly dude. And this photo is of the Amsterdam Haringgracht, and it inspired a scene in the book. So there you go. It actually, I ended up the last major trip that I got to take before we all started in this pandemic thing, was to Amsterdam and it was to the Netherlands and Belgium for a book tour when those books were released. And my publisher in the Netherlands actually put me up with a view overlooking this little canal. So that was very fun. So I enlisted a Dutch friend to find a copy of Truus's book for me. It's called, the translation of the title is No Time for Tears. She could find no copies for sale anywhere in the Netherlands, and her husband was a very good tech guy, and so he looked for me all over the world, and he could not find one anywhere either. So what she did was she finally got her library to borrow a copy from another library, and she photocopied Truus's whole book for me then. Don't worry about my integrity, because it turns out it's legal in the Netherlands to copy an out-of-print book. So nobody's integrity was risked there. And so then I took that book and the photocopy of the book, and I Google translated it paragraph by paragraph to get a better sense of who Truus was and some of the things she did. I gathered more images around me, including things like this bear that a child brought with him on the Kindertransport. Almost every child brought a German to English dictionary, like many of the children brought. So let that sink in. You know, they just didn't even speak the language in the place where they were coming. And I will tell you that so many of the people I've met who actually were involved in the Kindertransport had those dictionaries, and many of them still had them, 60 years, 80 years, 70 years later. They were allowed a single suitcase. This is an actual suitcase that one of the children brought, or a couple of actual suitcases. Most of the children were sent by train to Hook of Holland and then by ferry to Harwich, England. So they all had ferry tickets. And I worked on buttoning down all the details, which is sometimes more difficult than you can imagine. One of the things that I had a really hard time buttoning down was the date of the first Kindertransport that left Vienna. One of the things that happened was I found in the New York Times, before I found Truus's book, I found in the New York Times and the Times of London both a short little article, a little kind of stringer article, saying that they had left on a Monday in December. And then when I read Truus's book, it was very clear that they left on the Sabbath, that they were made to take these Jewish children on the Sabbath when many were forbidden by their religion to travel. This is what part of what Truus describes in her book as Eichmann's little joke to make them travel on the Sabbath. But so for a long time, I called the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum and asked them, and they didn't know. And they referred me to the Kindertransport Association. I contacted the head of the Kindertransport Association in the U.S., and she said they didn't know. She told me, basically there's a lot about the Kindertransport that nobody knows yet. And so it was very late in the game. I had finally decided, well, I was going to go with what Truus decided, what Truus said happened, because I know what happens with journalists sometimes, and those little stringers, sometimes they just get it wrong. And so I decided that to go with Truus's story. And then very late in the process, I found this calendar from one of the boys who was on the Kindertransport. And as you can see there on the 10th, it notes that on the 10th, on Saturday, he leaves on the train, and on the 11th, he arrives in Hook of Holland. So then I started my somewhat weird writing process. I'm often asked how I write, and if anybody wants to know more about that, I can talk about it in the questions, but pencil or keyboard, all that kind of stuff. And the general answer is any way I can and doing everything I can. I journal ideas, I outline, I write a billion drafts, and I do this, which you're seeing in front of me, which I call my card outline. And if you think that looks messy, let's just say this is the tidy version. So the real story is truly inspiring and uplifting. The risks that people took to bring these children to safety, often putting their own lives at stake for the sake of strangers. Surely we need more of that in this world we live in today. I could not be more humbled by the response to the novel. It's a Jewish Book Award finalist, a bestseller in far more languages than I can speak or read, which is, I'm going to say, incredibly moving to imagine that my story is reaching readers who I literally would not know how to say hello to if I passed them on the street in their language. And it's being published in, I think that says 20 languages now. It was 21, no, it was 20, and then it was 19 because Turkey, that deal fell through. But then the latest foreign rights we sold were in the Ukraine. So I guess we're going to see if that's going to happen or not, but I hope it will. And I'm incredibly grateful to be part of Truus becoming better known in the world. This photograph you're looking at now is a new statue honoring her in her hometown of Alkmaar in the Netherlands. But the most humbling part of this experience is the responses I've received from the real people involved. People like Marion Wolf, who wrote to tell me that she was number 211 on the first transport from Vienna, who wrote to me to tell me that my novel was just like she remembered it. This fella on the left here is Philip. Philip left Vienna when he was 5 years old, and is, for those of you who've read The Last Train, so like you would imagine Walter, the character Walter there, would be as a man. He came to a reading that I did in Southern California when I was on book tour down there, and he and his friend stayed afterwards, and we just talked for a long, long time. It was really, really a lovely evening. The bookstore event was lovely, but there was nothing lovelier than the time I had chatting with Philip. This is Erica Opper in the top right corner here. Her mother, Gertrude Ruth Friedman Opper, who's on the bottom left, was on a Kindertransport Gertrude is pictured here, also with her granddaughter Naomi and her great-granddaughter Lucy. And they are, as Erica said when she gave me this photograph, 4 generations who would not exist were it not for the goodness of strangers. And this guy in the middle here, his name is Paul Alexander. Paul lives in Israel. I haven't met him yet. We were going to meet when he was coming to the U.S. to speak, and then COVID, so we haven't met yet. But a friend of his who lived in the United States sent him a copy of The Last Train. It's coming out in Israel in Hebrew, but I don't know if that has happened yet. It was the first foreign rights that we sold. It sold at auction. There were a number of Israeli publishers who wanted to publish it, but I haven't seen the actual copy yet, so I don't know if it's been published or not. But Paul was somebody who was put on a transport when he was 1 year and 7 months old. He is believed to be the youngest child saved in this rescue effort. And he wrote me to say, he said, "I cried all the way through it. I read many books about the Kindertransport and the Holocaust, but your book, written so sensitively, is really special. It touched my heart from beginning to end. Thank you, Meg, for writing this book. And I can confirm, as you hope in your dedication, that your book more than does justice to my story." It's just so moving. That getting that email was so moving for me to have this idea that I might have helped someone understand their own experience really was incredibly moving. But so this photo is of Paul and his son and grandson. They retraced the path of his train. His train took 80 years later on bicycles. So honestly, if I had thought before I wrote this that these families would be reading this story, I'm pretty sure I would have been too daunted to have written it. It's Truus's story and that of the children and their families. But as I wrote it, I held in my heart the silence of my own son in that moment before he first told me about the Kindertransports. I hope it does them all justice and that truth will inspire others as surely as she inspires me. And I think with that, I will call the screen show and stop the share and see if I can answer any questions that anybody has.
Thanks so much. That was super, a kind of quick summary of much of the material that you cover in your book, but also gives us a little bit of the behind the scenes. And there are a number of questions that have come in, but I'm going to just toss one out to get us started as well, which is, you clearly did so much research, and you've given us the tip of the iceberg here. And so I wonder if you ever thought about writing a nonfiction book, and what was the benefit of writing it as a nonfiction novel?
Well, as Thorne and I discussed before you all came on, while we were, kind of in what would be called the green room if we were, together in person. I'm a history major. I was a history major in undergraduate history and psychology. But notwithstanding that, I'm less good at sticking with the facts than maybe I should be if I were writing nonfiction. I find that my imagination likes to take ideas and run with them and develop them. And I do think, one of the problems with, writing a biography about Truus is that it is so hard to find information about her. And it would largely have been in Dutch, likely, so I would have need translators and that kind of thing, even if I could find it. And what I wanted to give people was a feeling of what this effort was like. And I find when I'm reading fiction that it allows me to step in those shoes, in the shoes of other experiences, and feel them, not just read about them and learn about them, but actually feel what it would be like. And so that's what I'm trying to do with this novel too. I hope that everybody who reads it will imagine what it was like to be Sophie and her grandfather, and imagine what it would be like to be Stefan and Walter and their mother, and also, imagine what it would be like to be Truus or Norman and Helen Bentwich, or any of the real characters as well. To the extent that I do use real characters like Truus and the Bentwiches, I try to stay very closely to the actual facts of their stories. So, for example, for Truus, the stories you read about in my book about what she did are things that she actually did. There were places where I filled in the details. So, for example, we know for a fact that Truus never had children, but she never had children at a time when nobody talked about why they didn't have children, or even that they didn't have children. So we don't actually know why she didn't have children, but that was I felt a sort of an important element of the emotional impact of the story. So I explored, why she might not have had children and used that as part of the story. So when I take kind of what I call liberties like that, then I usually try to give a little bit of information in my my author's note afterward to say kind of what's real and what's made up.
I mean, that even though I asked the question, I mean, it's so clear. I mean, it really, you did such an amazing job of bringing us there. I've read many history books, but your novel really takes us there and brought me there, and emotionally in a far different way. So just as you explained. I want to start here with a comment that somebody posted. Peter Suchman wrote, Margaret Gutman Marx worked, we believe, with Gertrude Wijsmuller in Holland. She was our Aunt Margaret, or Auntie Margaret. She helped my dad to escape from Vienna in 1938. My mother also escaped on the same train in December. Mom and Dad met later and fell in love and got married. So like the stories you've been hearing, and you clearly, you touch people through this novel, and it turns out we have somebody going through that here on the show too.
I'm so very glad to hear that. I mean, almost every one of these events I do, there is someone who is very closely related to this effort, and truly the people I've gotten to meet through this book, it's just been remarkable. There's a character in the book whose name is Walter. He's a little boy. He's the brother of Stefan's little brother, and he is. I would used to say, don't tell my mom, but now you can't tell my mom. But my mom's dad's name was Walter. And my mom always thought that Walter was named after her dad. And we let her believe that. But in fact, Walter is a small homage to Walter Cohen, who is one of the real Kindertransport survivors who went on to become a professor at the University of Santa Barbara, University of California at Santa Barbara, and won a Nobel Prize. That just the people, and so one of the things I got to do is somehow or another my book ended up in the hands of his. It would be Walter's daughter-in-law, a few years after he'd passed away, and she reached out to me and said the family would really like to meet me, and could they do that? And we ended up all having a Zoom, and so I Zoomed with Walter Cohen's daughter and grandchildren, and it was just really a remarkably wonderful experience. So thank you so much for joining me. It's such a pleasure to have real people, and I wish I could see you. So.
There are a couple of kind of historical fact questions just about the scale of the Kindertransport. How many trains were there? Was it all Viennese children? Was it all Jewish children? Were any of the children sent back? Could you touch on some of those fact issues?
Yes, absolutely. It was a big effort, 10,000 children, as you can imagine. That's more than one train. What happened, the very first train was a small train of about 50 children out of Berlin. That were children from an orphanage. And I think that was pretty easy to do, partly because they were orphans. Then the next train was a train out of Vienna that was 600 children, which was a very large effort to organize, as you can imagine. But then after that, there were regular trains out of Vienna every week or so, much smaller, usually about 100 children at a time. But they also started then more transports out of Berlin, and then later on, so Truus's effort really started in December, very shortly after Kristallnacht, and she went through to right before, spoiler alert, to right before the war began in September. Nicholas Winton started some rescues from Prague in that summer right before the war began, and he saved about 600 children. Some of them went out by airplane, some of them went by train, but some went by airplane. And what they would do is they would collect children from all over the Reich, primarily Jewish children, but also Quaker children and other children at risk, children of journalists and things like that. They would collect them, they would bring them all to Vienna or Berlin for the most part, and put them on a train from there to go to get them out. So that's the first question. I think how many were there? That was a multi-part question. What have I missed?
I think you covered it. So it did include Jews and non-Jews. And what about the sending back? Initially, the British plan called for just a temporary allowance to stay in England. Is that right?
Yeah. So what they did was, the Parliament. It was quite an effort to get it passed through Parliament, but they did get clearance to bring pretty much an unlimited number of children out. And what they did was, at first, for the first groups of children, they just brought them out. They put them in that last place I showed you, the picture of the kids waving at the end by the little cottages. It's a summer camp called Dovercourt. And they put them there, and there was an adoption procedure through there where literally prospective foster parents would come visit the children, decide which child they wanted to take, and arrange to have them join them. As you can imagine, for the children who were not chosen each time, that was quite emotionally brutal. And so after those first couple of trains, they started arranging for foster homes for the children before they brought them over. And then if you had a foster home, then you would be put on a train and taken. I do not believe that any of the children were sent back. Some of them, the first placement wherever they were, some of them were put in schools and things like that, as opposed to in foster homes. Most of them were put in foster homes. Often, as you can imagine, the foster homes didn't work. These children had been ripped from their homes. They were emotionally brutalized, and again, often did not speak the language of the foster parents. And so some people who signed up to take in kids just found that they couldn't or wouldn't or whatever. And so those children were usually placed in a second home, or sometimes in a school, or kind of orphanages and stuff. Many of the boys, many of the older boys, once the war began, they were seen as enemy aliens. They were German, and there was even, never mind that they were Jewish and had to flee their country, there was concern that they might, be spies for the Reich or whatever. So some of them were sent to Canada, some of the older boys, and many of those older boys who were sent to Canada ended up joining the Canadian forces, armed forces, and coming back often as interpreters and or spies, because they obviously could pass as German because they spoke the language natively, and so that's what happened to a lot of the older boys. Some of the older boys were actually interned in Britain, and often with not captured Nazis. So I think if you look at the variety of experiences that the children had, it went from children who were taken in by their foster homes as adopted and lived with those parents forever, to children who had very dreadfully bad experiences, as you can imagine. It just was the luck of the draw who you ended up with for the most part. Yeah, so
yeah, thank you. There's a question from Frank Miller Small, who's actually the guy who put us in touch together. And I know
Frank,
he's been in touch with you. And he's a lovely gentleman and always an active member of our book club as well. But he writes a question about the newspaper that you have in the story. You have the Vienna Independent as a oppositional voice to the Anschluss and to the Nazi policies that are being enacted in Vienna. And he asks, was that an actual newspaper? And was there resistance to the Anschluss in Vienna? Or just we see the pictures that you showed us of the crowd cheering. So was there an opposition?
Yes. There was an opposition. That particular newspaper is fictional. I was looking for a way to to give people some of the history in a way that didn't fit really easily into the narrative of the story, but that I felt like people should have. So I came up with this idea of these newspaper stories. And I'll tell you that when my editor bought the book, it was bought at auction, a bunch of different publishers bid on it, but Sarah Nelson at HarperCollins bought the book. And when she bought it, those newspaper articles were they were drawn from real newspaper articles, but fictionalized, because obviously real newspaper articles have copyright issues, and so I just took what had happened and made up stories for it. And but they were just kind of random, And my editor said, so you have this journalist character, because Zofia Len's mother is a opposition journalist, and you have these newspaper articles. What would you think of having those newspaper articles be written by Katha, who was Zofi's mother? I was like, why didn't I think of that? That's so obvious a thing, but it just never occurred to me. So that was so then I did change and all that, but they are fiction. Katha is a fictional character, certainly drawn from real resistance in Vienna, though.
There's another question about how the first train load of children that you describe in your book is 600 children, and
Yes.
and Eichmann in your book, he requests 600 chocolates with a little train on them. And so one of the questions comes in was about this 600, where this number come from, if it was a foreshadowing of the 6 million, or where that number came from.
Oh, that's very interesting. I will say that it would be very clever for it to be a foreshadowing of the 6 million, but I'm not that clever. The 600,000 is I mean, the 600 that version is actually the number. Eichmann. Spoiler alert! Close your ears if anybody has not read the book and doesn't want to hear this, but Eichmann did require that number, not more or less, and that was his little joke. He did not believe that they could pull the effort together as quickly as he demanded they do. He thought that they would fail, and he would then have his excuse not to do anything. And when they did succeed in what he charged them with, then he let him go. So yeah.
Somebody also asked about your background. If there was, what prepared you for this? Was it a particular skill set you think you had that enabled you to capture such empathy in this book, or that gives us such a kind of powerful emotional connection to this period? What enabled you to do that? What enables you to do that in your writing?
Well, first of all, thank you. That's what I'm trying to do. So I really appreciate anybody who says that that's what's happening. I will tell you that this story, when I heard about this story, I just thought it was such a moving story, and I thought that somebody should write it. But because I'm not Jewish, I didn't think that somebody was me. My then agent at the time, Marley Rusoff, was a wonderful person, and she's Jewish. I know she has other writers who are Jewish. So I called her up and I said, Marley, you gotta, this is such an incredible story. Don't you have somebody who would like to write it? I would love to, tell them when I know about it and get them started. And she said, you need to write that story. I said, I can't write it. I'm not Jewish. We had this discussion a number of times. Every time, for years, honestly, I would say, I'm going to write this next. I was at the time publishing with Random House Imprint, and then I did some other things, and I would say, I'm going to write this next, and Marley would say, you should write that Kindertransport story, and I'd say, I can't write that story. And then when I did find Truus, then it did kind of open up the possibility that I could write it myself, because she was a Gentile. And by then, honestly, I was so steeped in this story of the children, because I'd been reading so much about them. I mean, first person narratives, I spent days up at the Holocaust Museum in San Francisco. The librarian there would pull narratives for me. And I would, if they're printed, I would take them home, or I'd listen to them, or whatever. The U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum has some people who really experienced it, some first person narratives on their site, and I'd read books and stuff like that. So I was so steeped in it that I felt like, you know, I knew the experience pretty well. But part of it was, and I feel this is true about everything I write, that if something doesn't move me to tears, then it's not a story that I should write, because I need to be feeling that emotion myself. And I will tell you, it's like a no comparison whatsoever. But when I was learning about this story, I was also letting go of my own children. My oldest was going off to University of Chicago, and then my youngest, you know, went off to University of Michigan, and so I was experiencing that thing of letting a child go, and so I at least had some emotional idea of that, and it certainly was something that I struggled with at the time, you know, letting my kids go so far away, knowing that they might never come back, which of course they haven't. You know, they've gotten on with their own lives and they're doing exciting things, and now we're going to have to move to the East Coast, it appears. So, but yeah, so that's part of where it comes from. I try to tap my own personal experiences to imagine what other people's experiences are like.
Okay, nice. Another factual question here. Somebody asked about the cutoff of the ages. And I know you said the youngest child was just over a year old. And as I recall in the book, I think there's 17 or 18. Was that the cutoff? Is that right? Was there a cutoff at the bottom too?
Yeah, there was a cutoff at the bottom, and I can't remember now. I'll tell you, I'm in the, you know, this research was now 5 or 6 years ago, and so some of the details escape me. And so I can't remember if the cutoff on the bottom end was 5 or 6. They didn't want to take younger children because it was just, you know, as you can imagine, they were only allowed a limited number of chaperones on the train, and so taking younger children was problematic. So most of, like somebody like Paul, who was so young, a year and 7 months old, people were so desperate to get their children out. I'm going to tell you right now that I just got a thing that my internet is unstable, so I hope you guys can still hear me. Nod yes. Okay, good.
Yeah, I lost it for a second, but you're there still. Yes.
Okay, great. So, so people who were very young, like Paul, their parents put them just like there were stories about people just putting their children on a train at the last minute, stuffing babies in baskets, put on the train at the last minute so that they would get out. Parents were really, really desperate to get their children out and would do almost anything to do it. A lot of parents. So.
And the chaperones you're talking about, these were non-Germans or non, you know, somebody like.
They were actually. Yeah, no, they were actually a lot. So some of them were like Truus, and then some of them were actually people from Vienna who were allowed to take the children as far as the border. So they would go from Vienna, they'd go through Germany, and they'd go as far as the border with Holland, and then the children would go on, and those chaperones were required to come back. And there was certainly, you know, any chaperone who didn't come back, they knew that would be the end of the transports. So all the chaperones, you know, came back. Yeah.
I just want to touch on your newest book, The Postmistress of Paris. It seems to have, I haven't read it, I will admit, although I'm looking forward to reading it. It seems to have some similar themes to The Last Train to London. It's exploring Paris under German occupation and the efforts of another woman, not Truus, but another woman, an American, to help artists escape from the Nazis. Is that right? So
yeah, that's exactly right. Yeah.
And so, do you see it as a sequel? Do you see it as what made you decide to write about that?
You know, it's interesting. It's not a sequel. I explored the possibility of writing a sequel. I didn't think I could. I explored the possibility of following Sophie, Len, and Stefan further on, the children, and Walter further on. The Last Train to London was hands down the most emotionally wrenching book that I've ever written. And by the time I was done with it, I was fairly exhausted. And I did not feel I could at that moment continue on with the children. And then there's also the problem of any kind of representative experience of the children because their experiences were so diverse. I felt like I would, by telling one story, maybe leave out a bunch of other stories. I might still do it, you never know, but I was not ready to do it at the time. And so I thought, well, maybe I would. Truus did a lot of interesting things beyond beyond this period of the Kindertransport after the war began, and so I actually was, and she was, in the novel, she's arrested by the Gestapo in Vienna. That's a real event. She actually was arrested by the Gestapo in Vienna, and so in real life, she was actually also arrested a second time by the Gestapo in the south of France. And so I thought, I wonder what Truus was doing in the south of France. So I went looking to find out what she was doing in the south of France, and I found this story of Varian Fry. Many of you may know who he was, but he was an American who went over to France with a list of prominent artists and writers that he could get American visas for and get them out of, if he could get them out of France. And we're talking about like Picasso and Chagall and people like that, Hannah Arendt and Nobel laureates and writers and great thinkers. Those were the people who were on his list, and they all one of the people involved in that effort is a woman named Mary Jane Gould, and she rented this old ramshackle villa called Villa Arabelle, where a lot of them lived together as they were undertaking this effort. And I saw, it's just kind of, you follow this path and you see where it takes you, and I came up, through this rabbit hole of looking, starting with Truus and ended up with Mary Jane Gould. And again, it's just, what moves you. I saw a picture, one of the real characters that is in that story is a guy named Danny Benedite. And I saw a picture of him outside of Villa Arabelle, literally hanging a Chagall painting from a tree, from one of the plane trees out on the Belvedere at Villa Arabelle. And I was like, what's that about? And so it was that when I saw that photograph, I thought, I just have to know more about this story. And then the more I read about Mary Jane Gould, the more I just, I so admire her. And I thought she was such a fantastic, real person. And so I used her real acts as a jumping off point for a very fictionalized version of that's kind of a mashup of Mary Jane Gould and a German refugee named Lisa Fitko. But that's how, it's how stories get you. I don't know. Sometimes I think it's a little bit like, musical chairs, where are you when you have to sit down and actually start writing the next novel? But that's kind of how that came. It was a natural follow-up to this story. It's very much about the extraordinary real things that happened in order to help people escape. It's considerably lighter in many ways than The Last Train to London. I mean, The Last Train to London, I hope, is incredibly moving. But it is also, I think, especially because it deals with young children, it's, as I said, it was the most emotionally wrenching thing I've ever written. And so the Postmisters of Paris, well, The Last Train to London is a love story. Those, Zofia Len and Stefan and even Truus and her husband, those are nice little love stories. But the Postmisters of Paris is a little more solidly a love story. It's a little bit, it's very much an adventure story, and it's a little easier read, I guess. It's not light to at all, but it's a little easier read, I think. Art and Paris and fashion and people. One of the things that really drew me to that story was that at Villa Arabelle, as these people are literally risking their lives to help people escape, they also just managed to have a great time. They would hang around the piano at night and sing together, and they'd play all these funky kind of surrealist games, and so there was a lot of spirited good fun going on there, even as they were in Nazi occupied France and helping people escape. So it was just a really nice juxtaposition. I felt like it was a really, really great demonstration of human resilience, I guess, that people manage to have fun in times like that. So.
Well, I certainly will agree that I found The Last Train to London as a very powerful emotional read. Although even if you told me that the Postmistress of Paris was going to be equally, I would still be lured to it. by by how much I benefited and enjoyed and felt connected to the story you told us in Last Train to London. But if it's a little lighter, also maybe maybe even more incentive for me to pick that up and read it. I
Yeah.
do one just a quick question to finish up, and then we're going to wrap up. Somebody just asked, could you say the name of the girl who you had that you found out was the person who became the model for your Zofia Helen's character? You said you tracked down and found at Kenyon College in the archives the name of the actual person.
Yes, yes, it's a Helen Krager. Helen Krager is her name. So yeah.
Okay. Well, Meg, thank you so much for doing this. This has really been super an eye opener into this book, and thank you all for watching out there. And I hope that you enjoyed this program, and I look forward to seeing you in some of our other programs soon. So thanks, everybody. Have a wonderful evening or a wonderful late afternoon for you, Meg. Thanks so much.
Thank, thank you, and thank you everybody for joining me. Have a nice evening.
Bye-bye.